Some people say politics don't belong in food writing. Others say that food is naturally political. How do you make a cookbook that's blatantly political and also full of deliciousness? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for readers, writers, and cooks. My name is Andrea Wei, and I am here today with my co-host, Molly Stevens. Hello, Molly. How the heck are you?
I am just fine. How are you?
Well, so I want to know, I've never asked you this. Where do you fall in the food and politics or not continuum?
I was just thought of this earlier. You know the movie The Devil Wears Prada?
Yes.
And that much often quoted scene of the blue sweater.
Yes.
Where the character played by Anne Hathaway is wearing a blue sweater and she thinks it's just this old thing and has no interest in fashion. And Meryl Streep character gives her a lesson on how you didn't just choose that, it was chosen for you. And I feel it's true with food. You may say food's not political or it's not a political act for you, but the food that's available to us, the food that we choose, the food that we buy, the food that we gravitate towards, that's all part of a bigger system. So yeah, I think whether cooking is a political act on a day-to-day basis, I think that gets a little more complicated because there's issues of food security and people need to eat. But yeah, food's political.
Yeah. How you source your food and also, the history of food. But it doesn't need to be a strident situation, but I think thinking about food is something that we ought to do, something that we consume every day, which is why I'm so excited today for our guest, Clarissa Wei. I've known her for quite some time. She's a journalist and debut cookbook author based in Taipei, Taiwan. She has extensive reporting experience in video and print journalism and now has a new cookbook made in Taiwan. You've likely seen Clarissa's byline in the New York Times, New Yorker magazine, Los Angeles Times, as well as National Geographic. For about 2 years, she reported for the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong and has traveled through 23 provinces in China, Molly.
Yeah, backpacking too.
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm just very curious how all that time in China and Hong Kong and now living in Taiwan has prepared her for this project that she's undertaken, this big cookbook.
I am not sure either. So let's get Clarissa into the conversation. Welcome, Clarissa Wei.
Thanks for having me, guys.
It's so nice to meet you.
Lovely meeting you as well.
We're so excited because we've both Molly and I have been checking out your work, going through every single page. And one of the things that we want to know firsthand is that you grew up in LA in the San Fernando Valley, and I followed your byline for years and stuff. And all of a sudden I noticed that you're in Asia, in East Asia. And so when and why did you decide to move permanently to Taiwan?
Yeah, it was a gradual process in my career. I was covering Chinese and Taiwanese restaurants in Los Angeles and just got really curious about sort of the source material and the inspiration for all the food. And that led me to multiple trips to Asia. I was backpacking through China, spending long stints in Taiwan where I have dual citizenship. And in 2018, I got a job offer in Hong Kong where the offer was, hey, you can travel to China once a month, all expenses paid. You have a whole videographer team. You can go wherever you want and just film the food and people of China, which was a dream job. This was for the South China Morning Post. And I took that job and I've kind of been stuck in Asia ever since. I didn't purposefully move here. I got married. Now I have a kid and we moved to Taiwan just because Taiwan is a easier place to live than in Hong Kong. And it's where my family is from. So it was an inadvertent move, but it worked out really well for my career.
Your family's from there. When you were growing up, did you go back to visit as well? So would you have some familiarity with being there?
Yeah, I would go every winter break to see family, but it was only 2 weeks out of a year. I never lived in Taiwan long term. And then as an adult, I brought myself back out of curiosity and for freelance writing. So I would stay 3 months at a time. But I really did not move to Asia full time until 2018.
So your parents didn't make you go on those Taiwanese American trips?
No, the Love Boat.
The Love Boats.
No, they didn't. We're from the South, which is the culinary capital of Taiwan. So our trips are very much geared around food. We would just land in Tainan and they would spend the whole night street food hopping from vendor to vendor,
God.
going to the places that they missed the most. And that was what my childhood was about in Taiwan.
Yeah, you tell a great story about your dad and the convenience stores
Yeah.
in your book, and it really comes through.
Yeah, they've slowed down, but in their younger years, they were obsessed with food.
Yeah, well, Molly and I have only visited Taiwan separately, not together. So
Right.
different time periods and stuff. So we really appreciate what you put into the book. This is your debut cookbook. So what compelled you to write Made in Taiwan if you didn't anticipate living there, for example?
Yeah, I think it came out of a frustration, first and foremost, of how Taiwanese is covered by international media. Before living in Los Angeles, every time I talked to someone about Taiwanese food, they were like, oh, Taiwan has such great Chinese food. I love going there for the dumplings, for the regional Chinese banquets. And that was very much true in the 80s and maybe even early 90s when Taiwan was a beacon of regional Chinese food. But it's been many years since then. I think LA has better Chinese food than Taiwan now. I can't find a good Sichuanese restaurant in Taipei. I actually found just one the other day and it blew my mind. It was such a novel find. So in short, I feel like the conversation around Taiwanese food is very, very outdated. And I really wanted to update that conversation. And then the second reason was I was living in Hong Kong and sort of saw the whole national security protests happen and saw how quickly a place's sense of identity can change overnight. And that has happened in Taiwanese history as well. You know, with every new regime change, there's this amnesia that happens where people sort of forget their history and what their culture and food is. As you guys probably know, Taiwan is facing unprecedented threats on a daily basis. And I really wanted to, capture the zeitgeist and the story of Taiwan before it's too late. I mean, we have an election coming up that could be very decisive in determining how our politics goes. But we're in a very delicate time. So yeah, it's two parts, sort of preserving what's going on, but also updating people on what people are eating here in Taiwan.
Yeah, so I want to get to that. So how your book is, there's an urgency to the book and a call to action. But to back up a little bit, I mean, you're a journalist. Your background is as a journalist, and that your choice was to write a cookbook and not a book about the food, but actually a book with recipes in it. And so that's a really striking choice. And I'm just wondering, how do you gear up to write a cookbook? Because you weren't a recipe writer before this, necessarily.
No, yeah. I wasn't. And so that was why I chose to team up with a recipe developer. And that was kind of, it took me, this cookbook went through 2 rounds actually of pitching. And the first round, it was just, me, and I didn't even put the political aspect into it. And the second round, I was like, okay, let's beef this up a little bit. And I found my recipe developer who has been teaching Taiwanese cuisine for 2 decades. And I really tapped into my journalist side where it's, no longer these are my recipes. It's let me interview people and work with people to push out their recipes and give credit to the people in Taiwan. And that really made all the difference. I think when I leaned into my journalism background, that is what made this book special and what made it stand out. Because before that, the proposal didn't really have that much legs and people didn't really see how it was different from any other book out there about Taiwanese food. Not that there are many.
Right. Well, of the few, they're Taiwanese American books, right? They're not like Taiwanese Taiwan books.
Exactly.
So did you work through the 2 rounds of the proposal with Nicole, your agent?
Yeah. And a lot of it was timing first. So the first round, this was, I believe it was 2019 or no, sorry, it was early 2020. So the world was going through a lot at this moment. And the feedback was, oh, we have a Taiwanese book already or a blogger who is of Taiwanese heritage. And then in 2021, when I repitched it, a couple things happened. The Stop Asian Hate movement had happened. And I think the world finally realized what was happening in Hong Kong, even though it was an ongoing process. And I think those 2 elements, people were finally like, oh, Taiwan is important. The politics is important. And the second time around, I incorporated the politics in my proposal. The first time, it wasn't something I talked about at all. It was more like, let's just talk about Taiwanese food as, you know, a tourist visiting in. But the second time, I incorporated that urgency, in part because I felt that urgency after COVID and seeing what happened in Hong Kong. And it worked, and the proposal finally sold in 21. So it's interesting how timing, as you guys very much know, timing played a huge factor in this book.
If it was placed in 2021, making the book was very fast.
Yeah, 2 years.
2 years to pub date.
Pub date, yeah. So 9 months of testing and research. It was incredibly stressful. Again, I'm sure you guys know, but I managed because I had a team. So with Ivy, the recipe developer, the process was that she gave me the base recipe. So I didn't really have to spend time, you know, developing a recipe from scratch, if you will. But there was a learning curve in Taiwan, or in East Asia in general. There isn't this rigorous culture of recipe testing. There isn't this culture of measuring things out. So initially things weren't really working out. I was like, why doesn't this recipe work? But Ivy's a really fast learner. And after a while, we were sort of getting in the groove. So every month she would send me, you know, 10, 15 recipes, and I would go through them and retest them and tweak them so that they would work. And simultaneously, I would be doing research, and I had hired a researcher to answer some of my prompts and dig into books and go into the library and comb online for some of my pressing questions. So I had people helping me while I was putting together the manuscript. If I didn't have my team, this would not have taken 2 years. It'd probably taken 5.
Yeah, I mean, because there's so much information in this book, and we'll get into some of that, but I'm thinking sort of organizationally. So it sounds, and correct me, Clarissa, that in your proposal that you had a general organization in mind. You had these chapters about like Tainan gets its own chapter, and there's lunch. It's a very unique chapter organization. And I'm thinking maybe you had some of the essays in mind. And so did you have a recipe list in your proposal, or?
Yeah, I had a recipe list, and before it was more standardly organized. It was like proteins, vegetables, and it was actually my editor, Justin, that proposed to arrange it thematically. And that really helped me focus in on the book and tease out some of those essays. I had a lot of those essays in my original proposal already, but I think reorganizing all the chapters to be thematic, I was able to place the essays where they belonged, and more essays sort of came up. And Justin was very generous with kind of giving me creative freedom. I would think of a random essay and he would never say no. Like, I could just put in things. The only constraint I had was obviously space constraints. Right. But I think when he suggested to organize things thematically, that's when everything started to fall into place.
When you were putting together the proposal and then writing the manuscript, who did you envision as your target audience?
Honestly, it's the very critical Taiwanese Americans who have spent a lot of time in Taiwan. I mean, Andrea, I'm sure you know too, some of the most critical people are the Asian Americans.
Your own.
Yeah, your own.
Yes.
And not even the people who have just spent their time in America. It's like the folks who go to Taiwan a lot or like grew up in Asia. Those are the most critical. And there's this obsession, and I hate this word, obsession with the concept of authenticity. And I never, that word does not appear anywhere in my manuscript. But I kept those people in mind because I think throughout my career, those people have been the most critical and the most discerning. And I thought if I could appease them, or if I could create a piece of work where they could have nothing to say or nothing critical to say, then that would be the best work I could put out for this book.
Yeah.
And that comes through in the writing too, and in the structure of the book, in the front matter, because there's not that sort of go shop at your specialty market. I mean, you talk about the pantry and but there's not sort of, you're not talking down to your reader. You're talking to your reader as if, whether or not they already know this food or they have a comfort with it. It's not exotic.
No.
Which I think we're so done with those books.
Yeah,
like making this othering this food.
We are. And I think that kind kind of ties into how I even was able to sell this proposal. It's the timing, right? Like, I think if I did this 5 years ago, people would be like, you have to start from the very basic and explain.
You have to give mail order sources for the dried squid or something. It's like, no, you don't. Just
exactly. And I was able to put in ingredients that are even to this day quite hard to find in the States. But because we live in a world where you can really Google things and have specialty importers, I didn't feel like I was being restricted in terms of that. And I think having the recipe list and ingredient list stay true to Taiwan as much as possible is what made this book as successful as it is.
The title, Made in Taiwan, I mean, Molly and I are of a certain age where we remember products being with labels on the bottom that said Made in Taiwan. And you could have chosen a lot of other titles, I imagine. So why that one?
Yeah, I think it just sums up my thesis very well, in that Taiwanese food is unique to Taiwan. And our pantry items and our building blocks of our cuisine, everything has been made and designed and special to Taiwan. So I just thought those 3 words just summed it up. And everyone, as you guys know, like, I mean, I grew up with that phrase too, Made in Taiwan, when you see products and you flip on the back. And I think it's snappy and it's short, and it just sums up the whole book in one short slogan.
Yeah, it works.
And we've had books in the recent past that were very much like focused from a strong point of view and had a lot of nationalism and cultural pride. And you mentioned that urgency in Made in Taiwan, because there is this existential threat constantly from the Chinese. And for folks who are listening, you should become familiar with what mainland China loves to do, which is have these military exercises around the island nation of Taiwan. And they have names, that are very threatening sounding to those military exercises. So, like, you did a lot of different things to kind of like present the culture, present this zeitgeist, and then also do a call to arms in the kitchen. And so let's talk a little bit about your strategy for weaving in that nationalism and history, because I think that that's really what makes the book very unique and fascinating, down to like the inclusion of both Mandarin and Pinyin as well as the Taiwanese. And you have them in 2 different colors. And I studied Mandarin a long time ago. I studied traditional and simplified. It's so difficult, the traditional version. And so,
it is, yeah.
And also I touched on the Wei-jiao system too. And when you presented the Chinese, I was like, oh, I'm so glad you didn't present the Wei-jiaos, because it's so hard.
It's so confusing.
It's very confusing. So all of that, built into the book, along with these other elements that we'll touch upon. When you were going into putting the manuscript together, how did you piece those things into the manuscript?
Yeah, and I guess I forgot to mention, while I was writing the manuscript, I was also working as a video producer for a lot of international media coming into Taiwan. And I would be interviewing military officials and government officials, and also doing pieces on identity, and just hearing all of these people talk about the threats to China and how we must preserve our culture and how Taiwan is different, that kind of fueled me or motivated me to infuse that into my recipes as I was writing the book. So I was doing these things simultaneously. And I think, the recipes are pretty straightforward, but for the head notes, I just made a really conscious choice to figure out what made every single dish unique to Taiwan, even if the dish has, Chinese origins, but while it's been here in Taiwan, it's been tweaked a little bit. So that really came from the research that we did. And again, I gave my researcher these long prompts and would be like, why is the shrimp and pineapple unique to Taiwan? How was it invented? So even if the head note is just 100 words, she would give me like 2 pages of sources and go into that. So I think it just came from a lot of research, and a lot of this does not exist in the English language. Hell, a lot of it didn't even exist in the Chinese language. We had to call up a lot of like chefs or factories and ask them about their history and figure that out. But it was really motivated by the work I was doing on the side, which was interviewing government officials and people who are a champion for Taiwanese identity and seeing how they talked about Taiwan. And I sort of used that sort of spirit in my writing.
Yeah, there's a real sense of wanting to document this time and these individuals who are contributing to the food. And, you say in your front matter, it's so important to use the Chinese characters because many of the people that were interviewed in the book or whose recipes are represented wouldn't have been able to see themselves in the book. And so this notion of seeing themselves, seeing the Taiwanese people being able to see themselves in your stories and your recipes, you really feel that as you read through these recipes and the essays in it.
That's always been a pet peeve of mine where I read a book or a guidebook about Asia or China or Taiwan, and they talk about a person or a chef, but their names are only in English and it's a translation, and there's no way I can find where their restaurant is or who these people are. And I did not want to do that to the people here in Taiwan. And the solution is just to put the Chinese characters afterwards. I know the majority of American readers will just gloss over that, but for the people who come to Taiwan and are really gung-ho about tracking down this chef or restaurant, with those Chinese characters, you just plug it into Google and you can find that restaurant. And I really wanted people to find these folks because I think, again, it's because I live here. I think a lot of people who write about Asia, it's like this is a exotic backdrop where people are eating by the street and it's all very romantic. But now that I've been here so long, it's like these people deserve credit too, even though they might not speak the same language as us.
I love your comment about, is it the CP quotient?
Yeah, the CP value.
Yes. And the CP value, we at the end of that essay or the introduction, you talk about how just think of that next time you eat some dumplings that, when you try to make these recipes that you can actually buy for $5, or whatever the equivalent is, that it's striking. But Andrea and I were talking and wondering, did you ever have a conversation with your editor about having a index in Chinese?
No, I didn't have that conversation.
Just curious.
That would have been interesting. I mean, I think it boiled down to space constraints too.
Yeah, and it's not a small book.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you would have had to cut probably.
Yeah, it's almost 400 pages already.
2 to 4 pages of text to allow for recipes in both Mandarin and Taiwanese, and then the characters.
And I already took liberties with the recipe development too. So for all the rice-based recipes or the pastries, there's how to make it with rice flour, which is easier, but also how to make it with raw rice grains from scratch. And that was something I sort of pushed for, even though it probably wasn't necessary to do it from raw rice flour, but I really wanted to include those steps. And that really elongated the book because there are a handful of recipes like that. And now those pages are double because I chose to include that extra tedious instruction.
So why did you do that?
Just because I think rice is really important to Taiwanese cuisine, and there are different types of rices and they have different properties, and how they are used, different dishes have different types of rice based on its sticky content or how it works in a dish. And the rice flour, I think the brand I use is the elephant one that you can find at all the Asian.
Three-headed.
Yeah,
Erawan,
exactly.
Three-headed elephant. Yeah.
Yeah, and that one is long grain rice. But in Taiwan, some people use a mix of short grain and long grain. So the rice flour recipe in the book, that's a very simplified version of how people do it here. But I wanted to include how people actually do it here, which is with raw rice kernels. So there's a simplified version for novice home cooks, but also a difficult one. And I think when you go through the more difficult step, it does taste different, in my opinion. Things made from raw rice are nuttier and it's much more fragrant and flavorful. And I thought it was important to include that, even though it was quite difficult writing that recipe as well.
Yeah. Right. No, I've gone through that with certain Vietnamese rice crepe recipes in Evergreen Vietnamese. And I'm like, here's the way to do it with the rice flour from Thailand. Here's the way to do it with soaking rice and using the blender, and there's a difference. And if you want to use Bob's whole grain, that's an option too, but you need to understand what you get in the end result.
Exactly.
And if you soak rice, even rice from the regular supermarket, long grain rice, is going to taste better than the flour that you purchase.
Yeah, but there are so many variables too. I was realizing, when you strain it through a cheesecloth, how much of that kernel is left or that flour is left really depends on how thickly woven or how tightly woven your cheesecloth is. So
how many layers you fold it,
Yeah, so it was very technical. A lot of this book was more technical than I anticipated. So that was such a challenge for me.
You love everything cookbooks, right? Well, we love making it for you. And if you'd like to help keep us going, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There, you'll find links to our new merch, the coziest t-shirts and sweatshirts, and our bookstore where we earn commission from every book you buy. You can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Again, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us some love. And thanks for listening. You mentioned Ivy, who developed all the recipes and then sent them to you. I'm just very curious about how that all worked.
Yeah, so it was very fluid. It wasn't like she wrote every single recipe and sent it to me. Some of the recipes, it was I would interview a chef and then I would come up with the recipe, but then she would double check it to make sure it was correct with the flavors worked. But at a base level, I had a list of all the dishes that I want. And Ivy is an encyclopedia. Like, you just ask her to make a dish and she can sort of whip it out immediately. And it was more of a collaborative effort. So sometimes she would give me a dish and I was like, this isn't how I remember it at this vendor. And she was like, what vendor is it? And then she'll go and like taste it and like tweak it so it tastes like that vendor. But it wasn't, not all 100+ recipes were directly from her. It was more like, I think the majority, maybe 80% was from her. The other 20 was, I would go to people's kitchens and watch them cook and create that recipe. But at the end, Ivy would always test it to make sure it was true to her flavor profiles. And the reason why I sort of used Ivy to retest all the recipes was I wanted some consistency and technique as well. I didn't want things to be all over the place because there are so many ways to do things. Like, for example, when you're making a broth, in Asia, you put the pork belly in cold water first and then you boil it to let the scum come off. But some people, they would just put it directly in boiling water, or they would have different methods. So Ivy and I made sure everything was standardized so the home cook doesn't get confused.
And you also, there's one recipe where she seems like she was a bit of a stickler too. Like you wanted to take a shortcut. And she's like, no, we're not doing the shortcut. I'm blanking on what recipe it was.
I mean, so many of them. I remember there's a recipe for a peanut ice cream roll. So it's kind of like a thin crepe with ice cream inside and peanut powder. And I was just going to be like, let's just teach people how to make the crepe, and then they can just buy ice cream and put peanut powder. And then she was like, no, Taiwanese ice cream is different. It's made with cornstarch. There's no milk in it. We need to have the right ice cream. And then for the peanut powder, even like you really could just buy crushed peanuts and add sugar into it. But she was like, we need to make the peanut candy because they shave that peanut candy down to make the peanut sugar. So we and I humored her because I'm curious too, but it would, some of these recipes, like it would take 2 weeks for her to figure it out. And I was like, this is taking way too long. And I would have crossed it out in the manuscript already. But sometimes she literally showed up to my door with the final product and be like, look, taste, we got it right. And after all that work she put in, I couldn't say no,
I love her.
I love Ivy Chen.
Yeah.
Let's back up a little bit to your master recipe list, because a lot of people may not be familiar with iconic Taiwanese dishes. So, tell us what is Taiwan? When you have to explain Taiwan to people, and Taiwanese cuisine, what do you tell them for those who've never been there? Because we're a little jaded. So.
I mean, I always say Taiwanese cuisine is a combination of all of our colonial influences or all our waves of governance. So it's really hard to define it as one specific flavor profile. But if I was speaking very generally, I would say we're more heavy on the rice, pork, and we're sweeter than most other cuisines in East Asia. But the reason why I always say it reflects our different waves of governance is Taiwan has been colonized by so many different entities. And with every wave of colonization, our food has changed dramatically. And that's what I wanted to capture in this book. So if you look at my recipe list, you have really traditional dishes like rice noodle soup for breakfast. But you also have black pepper night market steak, which maybe the average tourist would think that's just bastardized Western food and not Taiwanese, but I would argue that is extremely Taiwanese. Or we have hamburgers for breakfast as well. So the food of Taiwan is just the food that we eat here. I know that's very general, but I think that also reflects, again, my thesis on how the food of Taiwan is unique to Taiwan. Because whenever I argue with the trolls on Twitter, they're like, your food is exactly the same as the food of Eastern China or the Fujian province. And that is a part of our cuisine, but that's only just one part.
Yeah, they're not going to find like Thai basil in Fujian.
Yeah, exactly. There's little tweaks, that has happened.
Well, they're identifying that food within Taiwanese food, but that's not the it's just a part of it. Yes, there's similarities.
Yeah, but that's where the conversation is stuck. And I tell people, so my family and Ivy's family, we came with the first wave of Chinese settlers in Taiwan in the between the 16th and 18th century. And basically when our ancestors moved to Taiwan, that was when the United States was founded. That is so long, like no one in America identifies with England or like English food. Like American cuisine isn't conflated with English food. But for some reason, the food of Taiwan is always conflated with like the food of Fujian province because we have similar dishes. But like you said, we have like Thai basil or little tweaks. Our pantry items are very different.
Sushi, like on the streets.
Everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Everywhere. There's sushi.
Yeah.
I was only there for like 5 or 6 days researching tofu and I got it. I mean,
Exactly. And I think that's kind of why I like food or using the cookbook as a way to talk about identity. For me, my eureka moment was just looking at the pantry and I was like, wait, all of our main pantry items are made with Japanese era colonial recipes. They don't have that in China. People in China hate Japan. There's like very little connection. Whereas I'm sure you guys know when you have come here, people are obsessed with Japan here. Taiwan is almost like a mini Japan. And I think people who are deep researchers or scholars of food realize that as you tour around the city. But if you just drop in as a tourist and you're not paying attention to these details, you probably don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. It's a unique animal, and I think that you've captured that quite well. So how did you handle recipe testing? 9 months, for you to put together the manuscript, and you're in Taiwan. As we talked about before, most of the cookbooks about Taiwan have been written about Taiwanese Americans. And you think a long list of recipe testers and acknowledgments, including a very good friend of mine, Scott Hawker.
Oh, yeah. He was amazing. He was like one of the best. He was amazing.
He is pretty darn amazing.
Yeah, he is amazing. He's a friend of mine, too. How'd you find the testers? How did it all work?
Yeah, I just found them on social media. And actually, I think a lot of them came from Facebook and Facebook, I think on a base level feels kind of dead, but there are these really active cooking groups. So there's 2 really big Taiwanese ones with 20-some thousand people. And I just posted on there and most people had no idea who people don't follow me, they're not journalists or cookbook folks, but they're just really passionate about Taiwanese food. So a lot of these people came from there and then the rest from Instagram and Twitter. And I think we worked with over 50 people. And then I had my researcher / assistant sort of deal with the communication with everyone. And I gave each person 1 to 2 recipes to test. And that was critical for me because I was very aware throughout this entire process that my kitchen is a little bit different than the American kitchen. The stove here is like an inferno. It's really hot. So everything I sort of had to adjust, convert in my brain. And I had to make sure it worked in a Western kitchen. So getting people in the Western world to test these recipes was one of the most important parts of this whole journey. And so it was actually, I think more than 200 people signed up to be a recipe tester. It was a huge list. And again, it was mostly from these Facebook groups. And then we just chose 50 and worked with them. And that was really helpful because some of the recipes were clunkers. They didn't work. And so Ivy and I would have to go back and adjust and figure out what wasn't working.
Oh, I'm just thinking if 50 people sign up, to do this, and did that give you a boost? Think this book has an audience? There's a hunger for these recipes. People want to learn this.
Yes.
People want to taste this.
So I think a lot of the people who bought the book or the ones who are pushing the book are from these Facebook groups. And it seems so niche, right? Just like a small, I guess it's not small, but just like a Facebook group about Taiwanese cooking. But these groups were started because these people were tired of Taiwanese food being conflated with Chinese food. They wanted an outlet. So when this book published and I posted, hey, the book is finally out in the world in this cooking group, I saw a direct spike in the Amazon rankings. And even to this day, there are people who are hosting cooking parties just based on this book. And this is happening exclusively on Facebook. And these are private groups, right? You can't like search it. You have to join to see. So I do think there is this demand for this rather niche topic or cuisine, but a very strong demand because people who are passionate about Taiwanese food or of Taiwanese heritage, they don't feel like they're seen or they don't feel like their cuisine is well represented. And when there is a product or a book that represents that and satiates that frustration, it really has legs and it gets shared far and wide, which has been really cool to see because I did not put that in my proposal. I had in the marketing section, I had no idea how strong these groups would be.
Well, and the idea that it's niche is ridiculous because it's an entire nation of, so it's not at all niche. And that's part of what this book is proving is like, no, it's misunderstood. And there's a lot of people.
But I mean, it's niche in this. I understand what Clarissa is saying.
I understand it.
And it's a very focused topic.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the ways that you enable people to feel like they've been seen is through the photography.
Oh, yeah.
And you had an all Taiwanese photo team. I remember you proudly told me when we chatted last year. And of course, you were in Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, my whole team is Taiwanese, except for me. But the photography, that was like, I learned so much through them. And I had no idea I was going to learn so much through my photographers as well. How I did it was I just had my researcher give me a list of food stylists and photographers. And there's not a big industry for that here because we don't have as robust of a cookbook industry as in the States. So Yenwei and Ryan, who are my duo, they specialize in like restaurant photography and menus. And when they got this assignment, it was just like a fire under. They were just like, all of our commissions, clients in Taiwan want Nordic style plating or Japanese style plating. No one wants Taiwanese food. And I visited her in her studio in the south of Taiwan, and she had a back closet and it was just full of antiques that she had collected off the streets. And all of it had a history. And then when she read through my manuscript, her and Ryan went to a bunch of old antique shops or grandpa's houses and asked them for props, and they started collecting more. And then I was inspired by their dedication, and we contacted a bunch of museums to donate props as well. And what they did is they took every single chapter and designed mood lighting for every chapter. So like if you look through the night market chapter, the lighting is much more warm. Yep. If you look at family style, it's natural light. 95%, I think, of all the photographs are done in studio, even though a lot of it looks like it's street photography, but it was all purposefully designed. They would even go as far as to visit the restaurant I talked about in the head note. So if you look at the oyster omelet recipe, I talk about a restaurant in Tainan. They went there and noticed there was a banyan tree shading the tables. So they designed the photograph to look like there are leaves over the table with the shadows. And so it was this obsessive thing that they had. And actually, I don't know how it's like for other cookbooks. Maybe you guys can tell me, but each photo took like 1 to 2 hours to take because I was impressed that they did, because I don't think in Taiwan there is as stringent of a standard as there is in the States. But she had purposely picked out the props for everything, and all the dishware reflects how the dish is served in Taiwan. It's not random. It's not like, let me just find a pretty plate and put this dish over it. It's like, okay, this rice pudding dish was traditionally served in this white bowl with a blue rim. I'm going to find this white bowl with a blue rim with the exact same spoon that they have. And there's a lot of Easter eggs that I wrote in the photography notes, but there's a lot more that I just didn't have the space to write in. But if you had grown up in Taiwan or visited here or paid attention, I think if you look through the photographs, you'll start to see a lot of hidden elements, or that in and of itself is a journey or a story.
Yeah.
And that decision to include those photography notes, to rather than just have them be truly Easter eggs where if you know, but otherwise you wouldn't notice it, but you have these photography notes where you specifically say, this bowl is from, or if you look closely, you can see the oyster shells in the brick kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Talk about that decision to include those notes.
Oh, that was so spontaneous. I started jotting down those notes when we were photographing during the 2-week session.
You were on set, right?
Yeah, I was on set. Yeah. And then I was just inspired by them, and then I asked my editor Justin if I could include it, and he was like, sure, go ahead. So that wasn't something I planned at all. It was totally random and spontaneous, and I think it worked out.
Yeah. No, finding the space for it is hard on a page.
Yeah.
Because you've got a lot of content that you've organized in each recipe. So it's unusual, and I applaud you for doing it, because it is like really a tough thing. And why didn't you put those photography notes and work them into the head note, for example, which would be like a really nice organic way to weave those little items? Because not every single recipe has a photography note.
Because by then I had finished writing the head notes, like the manuscript was done, or 90% done. And so this was kind of like an add-on thing. And I thought for people who, not everyone reads through the head notes, but some people just like to flip through the photographs. And if they flip through the photographs, they can just look at this little sentence on the side and learn a little bit more. So I thought having it separate would make it stand out and highlight the photography more. But it was also just because I had finished writing everything and didn't want to rewrite.
And you had the space. I mean, when people look at the book, there's it's under the column. I mean, you have to make all that room for the 3 different titles as well, but several recipes have notes. And so you had this space, and you just dropped them into that space.
Yeah, kudos to the designer. I have no idea how she managed to put all of that in.
So let's talk a little bit about promotion, because you did so much promotion. And I know you did that way in advance. And it seemed like every single week, Clarissa Wei had a byline.
Yeah, it was a lot.
I think you said that way back that it was a lot.
But we often talk about this on the podcast about getting your byline out there if you have the opportunity to, but if you're already an established journalist or a writer, to make sure you have a lot of pieces coming out when your book comes out.
Mm-hmm. And it worked out really well, because just throughout while I was writing the book, Taiwan would sort of make the news every now and then you would see these trolls on Twitter being like, Taiwan is a part of China because the food is a part of China. And that was just a really good opportunity for me to chime in. And those tweets would always go viral and amplify. And then towards when the book was getting closer to publishing, I started pitching more articles about Taiwanese food, which really helped gain momentum as well. But it wasn't hard at all, because again, it's timing. Taiwan was constantly in the news. There's been a crazy influx of foreign journalists here in Taiwan. So everyone wanted to interview me. Because when I had first come here, I think as an adult in 2013, I think there was just like a handful of journalists. Now there's like 20 plus from all over the world, and incorporating food in their repertoire of what to cover in terms of Taiwanese identity and tensions is a natural thing. So it wasn't hard landing or pitching these stories or chiming in with the conversation on Twitter, or even creating my own thread on Twitter that could go potentially viral, because Taiwan is in the news. So I think I just sort of rode this wave, or am continuing to ride this wave of Taiwan constantly being in the news.
You say it wasn't a lot of work. Pitching the stories, that's the work, but they were getting accepted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there was an openness to running these stories. So
yeah, and even like writing it wasn't that much work, because it was just piggybacking off of my research.
So much to say.
Yeah, and I have so much research already that I didn't really have to go out of my way to re-interview people or find new sources and whatnot. A lot of articles that were commissioned were on like beer food, for example, which I have a whole chapter on. So
just
I would
looking at an essay on that. Yeah.
So I took a little bit of the information I had on that essay, but then I would bulk it up with the other research that I had, because I had more of a word count for these online articles. So again, I think timing is so important for a book like mine.
those different voices, like writing as a journalist and writing as a cookbook author. Do you feel a switch when you're doing that, or your journalistic voice is the voice of this book and that's who you are as a writer?
Yeah, I think my journalistic voice is, I feel more comfortable writing in a journalistic voice, if you will. There are many times in the book where I do talk about my own family and recipes that my family have sort of passed down, but even writing it felt really uncomfortable. I prefer to sort of step back and let other people shine. And I think that's where my strength is as well, sort of curating different stories and recipes and giving credit to that. Because I myself don't really feel super confident in my abilities as a recipe developer or sole cookbook author. And when I realized that weakness and leaned into my strengths, I think that's when I felt more confident in this project.
Well, bless Ivy Chen then.
Yeah, she's...
And your researcher, Wu Xinyun.
Yeah, Xinyun. Yeah, and I think this is a sort of a lesson too into not being afraid to ask for help or not being afraid to ask for the resources to assemble a team. I think a lot of people... I think my first proposal, it was just me. It was like, I'm going to write this cookbook, be the sole byline on it. But when I was like, I want to open this up and use my strength and highlight other people, that really worked. And again, like I always credit my team, and this book would not be possible without everyone. And I think there's room for more books like this as well.
So you just mentioned you had to ask for the resources. So from the publisher?
Actually, they kind of just let me do whatever I want, which is like quite a blessing. I hear a lot of horror stories actually about editors pushing back or being quite strict with who you work with and whatnot. But my publisher let me sort of work with whoever I wanted. I got it in advance and I was able to spend it on whoever and whatever I wanted. I obviously told them who I was working with, and they had to look at Ivy's background and my photographer's portfolio as well and approve it, but I got no pushback at all.
Did any of the editorial team come over for the shoot or?
No. Oh, so most of it was kind of done during the second wave of COVID. So the travel wasn't really possible anyways, but that wasn't even a consideration as well. When we were talking about the photography team, I was insistent I wanted a local photography team, and there was no pushback on that. I just had to create a list of maybe 3 to 4 options, and I got to work with my first choice.
Were they looking at dailies?
Nope. I sent pictures every now and then, just to update them, but it wasn't like I had to send every single picture and see how I was doing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I don't know how the process is for everyone else, but I felt like I had a really amazing publishing team.
Well, maybe the time difference also worked in your favor, because we oftentimes are having to check in with art directors on a daily basis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I mean, Simon Element's New York City, right? So
yeah, they're in New York.
They're in bed when you're making your photos. So
that's true. Maybe it's the time difference.
No one wanted to work overtime.
No, we just got to do whatever we wanted to do.
Your book was born on September 19th, and you also had a baby.
Yeah, it all happened
the next week or something.
No, on the same week. The same week.
Okay.
I literally had a baby the same time.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And so I was sort of in bed. I had insomnia the days leading up to the birth of the book. And so I remember my publishing team being like, wow, you're so responsive on New York time. But it's because I could not sleep, physically. That's why I was posting on social media a lot, because I couldn't write or do any other work, but I could do. Social media doesn't require that much brain cells. So I was constantly promoting the book, and people thought I was just being really active and staying up late. But it was just because I had insomnia and I couldn't really do anything else except lie in bed and tweet.
Because you were 8.5 months pregnant.
Yeah. Exactly. But it's a lot. I don't recommend birthing a book and a baby at the same time, but I'm glad that's over.
Congratulations on both.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
So do you think you'll write another cookbook? Are you thinking of ideas?
Yeah, I actually would really like to do one on China, which sounds kind of contradictory to everything that I have been doing the last 2 years, because people think my book is very anti-China, which I always say it's not true. My criticism is with the government, not with the people of China. And I've actually spent a long time in the mainland of China, backpacking to over 24 provinces. And I have another Ivy Chen in mind, if you will, or like a recipe developer who has lived in all of these different provinces. So that's something I wanted to tackle. It's still early stages. I'm still thinking of my angle, but I find a lot of joy in interviewing people and sort of preserving and documenting their recipes. And I do think with the Chinese cookbooks, there aren't a lot of people like me based in Asia and being able to talk to people in real time and preserve their recipes. So I hope that could be the next project, but we'll see. I have a newborn, and I don't know if I can physically manage it.
Well, thank you for managing the time to come and talk to us today, Clarissa.
And of course, thank you for having me. It's nice to talk about the behind the scenes instead of just the macro political picture. I like talking about the nitty gritty of what goes into making a cookbook because it's really difficult, as you guys know.
We love hearing about it and really appreciate your sharing.
Thanks for coming on, Clarissa. We hope to hear more from you in the future.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to support us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.